This week I had the opportunity to watch a film which knocked my socks off. The film is a documentary on the life and ministry of Fred Rogers and is titled, Won't You Be My Neighbor? An excellent film. The film focuses on Mr. Rogers' television program, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and examines his motivation to purposefully teach children that we ought to love ourselves and love our neighbors. The documentary also explores his decision to use a children's program to address uncomfortable social topics like racial integration and peace between nations. He also used puppets to teach children how to deal with difficult topics like death and the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, or to explain divorce in a kid-friendly way. Mr. Rogers was the first to have a child in a wheelchair appear on television and was able to provide a human face to children with disabilities. Using Daniel the tiger, he encouraged children to talk about their thoughts and their feelings. Mr. Rogers was an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, and he lived his life off camera just as he did when the cameras were recording. Though he never mentioned God by name on his program, Fred did talk openly about his faith in interviews, saying in one interview that there is a loving spirit who longs for the best that's in all of creation, a spirit who knows the great potential of each person and little by little will love us into being more than we ever dreamed possible. That loving spirit would rather die than give up on any one of us. His message of love is based on his Christian upbringing, and he taught that God never gives up on any of us because we are all essentially valuable and lovable. This was his inspiration as he went in front of the cameras to provide a message of kindness and love. And it's an important message we needed to hear then and especially today. His message to care for each other caused him to be popular and loved by children and parents alike. Business News reporter Jill Rothenberg recalled when she was 5 years old that she used to hug the television at the end of his program while her mother looked on approvingly. However, not everyone agreed with his message of peace, tolerance, and acceptance. In 1975, Mr. Rogers responded to criticism he received from his fellow clergy, writing, I'm wary of people who insist on trying to make other people feel bad, because those who feel best about themselves have the greatest capacity to feel good about others. Mr. Rogers believed that teaching children to be kind would teach them to be helpers and would give them a foundation for their development. This message echoed Jesus' teachings that we should be neighbors to each other, and he taught Jesus' golden rule, declaring the power of goodness. However, like thorns in Fred's side, critics continued to tear him down, and they accused him of being a sellout who simply wanted to be popular as he watered down the message of Christ. Even at his funeral service in 2003, people picketed at the graveside service. They held up posters accusing Mr. Rogers of using syrupy teachings that led millions astray, and he was a wuss and was an enabler of wusses. Clearly, Fred's humility was misunderstood, but it isn't surprising when we consider that our society seems to reward arrogance and pride. Humility isn't a trait that has much appeal, especially when humility is mistaken for weakness or helplessness. Undoubtedly, this is as much true for our modern world as it was for Paul's time. Looking at the letter Paul wrote as a response to a letter the Corinthian church sent him, we can assess that he was accused by leaders of the church of essentially being a wuss. They believed he spent too much time speaking publicly about Jesus and what Jesus would require for us to live righteous lives. They also thought he should remain loyal to Jesus alone and only speak scriptural things and not use secular Gentile images as object lessons. One example of Paul using a Gentile image to teach about God is found in the book of Acts. Paul was preparing to defend himself in front of the Roman court to talk about his faith in Christ. And as he prepared for the debate, he began walking through a Roman garden, and he spotted an icon made for an unknown god. During the trial, he referred to that image, and he proclaimed that the tribute to an unknown god was actually a tribute to the known God of Israel, who loved the world and offered love, healing, and peace through Jesus. It was a message of inclusion and acceptance, and it changed the hearts of his listeners. But Paul's colleagues in Corinth weren't having any of that, and they were incensed. They accused him of watering down the message. I'm sure for Paul this hurt, especially since this came from the leaders of the church. However, being bad-mouthed and rejected was nothing new for Paul. He experienced this type of treatment every time he spoke publicly about his faith. However, there was one difference for Paul, according to a historian who wrote that the claims made by the Corinth church leaders went beyond the typical disparaging rumors. The church leaders were attacking Paul's character based on their religious pride, as they boasted that they were commissioned to proclaim the gospel through apostolic succession, whereas Paul, who had not studied with Jesus' disciples, had no relevance in their church and should remain quiet in public. Perhaps the leaders thought Paul was opening Pandora's box of trouble with the Roman authorities if he kept speaking publicly, or possibly the leaders of the church were jealous of Paul's oratory skills. At any rate, they were spiritually bloated in their attempt to highlight Paul's weakness in an effort to silence him. And unfortunately, we don't have the original letters sent to Paul, and Paul never named what his weakness was when he responded to their attacks. So we're left speculating, what was the thorn that was in his side? Some scholars claim that when he referred to the thorn in his side, he was suffering from bad eyesight, malaria, depression, or epilepsy. I've begun to wonder if the thorn that he suffered was caused by the shame and regret of his role that he played in the death and arrest of early Christians when he was an agent working for the Roman Empire and the Hebrew Sanhedrin. Evidence that this might be his thorn is based on his writings when he acknowledged that he humbly appreciated God's love and the warm reception he received from other congregations he visited. Assuming the thorn that Paul referred to in his letter was the shame and guilt he felt, can you imagine the ongoing stabbing pain he might have experienced when he saw the mental images of the faces of those he was responsible for imprisoning or having killed because of his hatred of Jesus and his followers? Perhaps his role in their arrests and deaths possibly haunted his daily thoughts. I imagine those lingering memories would have been painful for Paul. But, as he elegantly wrote, he found a way to turn his thorn around and utilize it for God's purposes. He found strength in his weaknesses to proclaim his understanding of God's grace and love displayed through Christ. Gracefully and with great humility, Paul responded to his critics, admitting that he was weak and he didn't have the credentials they had. Yet, he utilized their accusations to proclaim that since power is made perfect in weakness, it is ultimately not a hindrance, but a means by which to improve his work as a disciple, declaring, "So I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities for the sake of Christ. For whenever I am weak, then I am strong." Here, Paul possibly was referencing the suffering and discouragement Jesus warned his followers that they and we would encounter. Though the circumstances are different, both Jesus and Paul went head-to-head with communities who were more concerned about their preconceptions of who bore God's message, invitation to new life, and how the invitation was given, rather than focusing on the invitation itself. In Mark, Jesus had traveled throughout Galilee, healing and offering people wholeness. But when he spoke in his hometown, his neighbors recalled that he was the kid down the street, and they dismissed his words and rejected his invitation to discover God. Jesus could have been angered that they treated him as a wannabe. Instead, as he often did, he used the situation as a learning opportunity to teach his disciples how to fail with grace. He taught his disciples not to dwell on the wounds they received. Instead, take the lumps and get back up, but not in anger. Instead, simply dust yourselves off and keep living your life as a testimony of God. It's important and an important message for Jesus' disciples, and one that Paul utilized in his ministry. Every time he declared we should love each other, he was whipped and beaten. Yet he got up and kept preaching. Even when the leaders of the Corinth church tried to silence Paul, he kept teaching and utilizing his life to teach about Christ. In Fred Rogers' life, Jesus' instructions that it would not be easy to follow him is evident. Many times, Fred felt discouraged. He felt adults were not doing enough to protect children from violence. So he kept leaving retirement and returning to do his television program to address the brokenness of children, to remind them that they are special, that they are loved, and we all ought to care for each other. And we don't do it for our own glory. We do it for God. We fulfill God's plans by expressing care for each other, not by being spiritually bloated or arrogant or rude. Instead, we reveal the kingdom of God when we seek a radical way of living and loving that understands that God operates in an upside-down kingdom. That in lifting others up, we lift ourselves. That when we experience sorrow, we discover joy. That when we are last, we are first. That when we die, we live. And that when we are weak, then we are strong. As followers of Christ, living in a broken world that views humility as weakness, let us be humble anyway. And through Jesus, turn our weaknesses into strength so as we never become discouraged when our message of love is rejected. Instead, we are encouraged by Jesus to hold to hope as we keep loving each other from the heart, just as Jesus did. Encouraged not to become discouraged. Let us then follow Jesus' examples. We lift each other up and proclaim the good news by caring for each other and seeing each other as the unique, special person each one of us is made to be. Someone with a spark of God in them. And as Mr. Rogers would close the show each time, it's such a good feeling to know you're alive. It's a happy feeling you're growing inside. And when I wake up, ready to say, I think I'll make a snappy today. It's such a good feeling, a very good feeling, a feeling you know that I'll be back when the day is new and I'll have more ideas for you. And you'll have things you'll want to talk about. I will too. God turns our weaknesses into strengths. So let us love one another from the heart